An early morning jog on a late autumn day. It seems pretty routine, but it isn't, not for David Carmichael. Stretching his legs again, breathing the crisp air. He hasn't been able to do that for most of the past 3 years. That's how long it's been since, for no apparent reason, he murdered his son, Ian.
I gave him the sleeping medication around 10:15 at night. It didn't put him to sleep, it actually caused him to hallucinate. I don't know why, but he started to hallucinate. And I killed him around 3 o'clock in the morning, just before 3 o'clock. I strangled him.
But what would cause a loving father to kill his own son? It was a picture of the perfect family: David, his 2 children, and wife Elizabeth.
We had a great life. You know, we had 2 children, Ian and Jillian. My wife and I, we ran a business together. I was doing consulting work in terms of physical activity and sport.
Career-wise, David had become a nationally known fitness guru, a director of the government-run fitness program at the time, known as Participaction.
Participaction, the movement for active, healthy living.
What are the basics?
Well, basics
When the media needed a soundbite from some fitness expert, they often called on David Carmichael.
Those are some of the basic skills that if parents can do with their children when they're young, they might feel a little more confident in the sporting environment.
I went to the doctor and I explained my symptoms, and this is my family doctor, and you know, he felt that I was in a major depression and prescribed 40 milligrams of Paxil a day.
Paxil is one of a group of antidepressants known as SSRIs. Since the early 90s, they've been widely prescribed to treat anxiety disorders and depression.
After 8 months, I was feeling quite normal. I'd missed taking my antidepressant for a few days in a row. And instead of going back to the doctor, I just weaned myself off.
Why did you decide to go off the Paxil altogether?
I had some side effects that were quite uncomfortable with Paxil.
What kind of side effects?
I was sweating at night and sexual dysfunction. So I went to the local bookstore and picked up a book and read about it, and I just thought I didn't need the drug anymore.
In the summer of 2004, a year after his first bout of depression, the symptoms returned with a vengeance.
It was like a freight train. You know, the symptoms just suddenly reappeared. Within a matter of days, I knew that I was in trouble.
What'd you do about it?
I put myself right back on 40 milligrams of Paxil a day, knowing that I had to see my doctor as soon as possible, but I was so busy, I just didn't go to the doctor right away. I thought the doctor was just going to prescribe Paxil, and I already had a full prescription.
What David didn't know was that new studies were raising concerns about the side effects of SSRIs. And by mid-2004, new government warnings appeared, linking antidepressants such as Paxil with an increased risk of suicide.
So you self-medicated in effect?
I self-medicated.
And what happened?
I started to have suicidal thoughts after I put myself back on Paxil. A week after I put myself on 40 milligrams, I increased my dosage to 60 milligrams because I had read that it was all right. I had read that in the book that I was reading about Paxil when I took myself off. And I became delusional. I started thinking about not only suicidal thoughts, but planning suicides. And then I went from there to thinking that, you know, my son was in living hell.
After Ian began having seizures and was diagnosed with mild epilepsy, something in David Carmichael snapped. In his own mind, he came to believe that Ian's brain was dying.
Kids were teasing him a little bit about not being able to count money and things, and that his epilepsy became permanent brain damage in my mind. It was going to kill my daughter, and my wife was going to have a breakdown, and it was going to hurt other children. And this all happened within a 2-week period after I increased my dosage of Paxil.
Why wouldn't you have talked to somebody about that?
You know, when you're in that state, you really don't realize that your mind is thinking in such a distorted way.
Still to come.
I told him I love him, I'm really going to miss you, but you're in a better place now.
He killed his young boy. Can this murderous act be blamed on antidepressants?
It's not good to mess with the molecules of the mind.
When CTV's W5 continues.
David Carmichael, a loving father with no history of violence but suffering from psychotic delusions, murders his 11-year-old son Ian, puts his hands around his neck, and strangles him to death.
What was going through your own mind in those 20 or 30 seconds?
And I was doing the right thing. You know, after Ian was dead, I moved him to the center of the bed. I kissed him on his lips. I told him I love him. I'm really going to miss you, but you're in a better place now. I went and I turned on the TV and I watched it for 6 hours. Not a tear.
You just switched on the TV, sat down and watched?
And until 9 o'clock in the morning when I called the local police, told them what I had done. And they came and, you know, charged me with first-degree murder.
David spent 13 days in segregation on suicide watch. He was then sent here to the Royal Ottawa Mental Health Centre, where Dr. John Bradford, one of the country's top psychiatrists, diagnosed David as suffering from psychotic depression.
It was pretty obvious to me early on that he was depressed, that he was somebody who had believed that his son had an incurable disease.
And did he make it clear to you at the time that in his mind he had done the right thing?
Yes. People that have a psychotic depression develop this altruistic delusional belief that the whole family is suffering and therefore it's not worth living, everybody would be better off in heaven. Of course, none of this is true.
And when David's psychotic fog began to lift, the terrible reality set in.
I cried for 3 days straight. Couldn't believe where I was. Couldn't believe what I had done. I was shivering, I was so cold, just from dehydration from crying. The toughest 3 days of my life.
Tell me about the precise moment that it became clear to you exactly what you had done.
It was day 15. I know the day. I was in segregation. It was over a 3-day period, but even after that day on the 15th of August, I remember when there were times where I'd still slack back, trying to convince myself it was the right thing to do, but then I could no longer convince myself, because even to me, those thoughts were irrational now. And my son was gone.
1 year later, David was on trial for murder, a trial that didn't last long. At the London courthouse, there was no argument, none at all. Both the judge and the prosecution agreed with Dr. Bradford. David Carmichael was in a psychotic state and therefore not responsible, at least not criminally, for the murder of his son.
It's the first time it's ever happened to me that the Crown, who has the right to cross-examine, said, I have no questions.
What wasn't brought up in court, it wasn't considered relevant to the case, was whether the drug he was on, the antidepressant Paxil, had anything to do with David's psychotic state. But a raft of lawsuits against the makers of SSRIs such as Paxil suggested perhaps it did. One of the first to study and write about the role antidepressants play in violent acts and testify about it in court is American psychiatrist Dr. Peter Breggin.
Well, it's very, very striking that it has the pattern of 50 or 100 cases I've looked at fairly closely where people have committed mayhem, murder, or suicide on psychiatric drugs, particularly the antidepressants. And the pattern is that the person stopped the drugs and then started the drug. Carmichael started the drug again less than 3 weeks before he kills his child. And what we find is that it's that initial few weeks when the drug has the most impact, when it's either increased in dose, decreased in dose, or stopped.
So there'd be little question in your mind that David Carmichael's psychosis was directly related to the Paxil?
It looks directly related.